bread is the food of the Englishman throughout history, and as the hymn says, you begin the process with you plough the fields and scatter the good seed on the land, but it is fed and watered by God's almighty hand. But today we're going to start with the harvest, and the harvest is made with this tool. This is called a sickle, and it's used by grabbing a handful of your standing crop, and then you would cut through like that. This makes the sheaf of corn. As you walk along, you're going to be dropping these sheaves. Somebody else is coming along and binding them, and then they're gathered into stooks, and they stand in the field, the stooks of corn, while they hear the church bells 3 times. 3 weeks. Now I'm dressed in my dairymaid's dress because the house servants and the dairymaids all go out in the fields twice a year. They all go out and help with hay time, and they all go out and help with the harvest, because if you don't get the harvest in, everybody goes hungry. So getting the harvest in when the weather's fine and getting the grain ready to load and take back to the farmstead guarantees the food for everybody for the coming year. The corn was taken out of the fields back to the farm and put in ricks, and over the winter the corn was threshed as and when it was needed, and this is the implement that you thresh it with. This is the flail, and this was the implement of choice of the Englishman during any sort of civil disturbance or riot. If you think of the Peasants' Revolt, lads armed with these could do some damage to a knight on a horse. And this is how it's used. So it's basically an overarm swing, and if with practice you can get quite accurate. Several of you in a ring take it in turns, you get a good rhythm going, and to help the rhythm, the threshing floor is hollow with things like horse skulls underneath to aid the acoustic. Threshing floors could also double as dance floors for the same reason, but the emphasis is on the steady rhythm of the group of people. But when you get to the start of the Industrial Revolution and you've got the cities like Newcastle growing apace, you can't thresh enough corn fast enough to feed the urban population, and this was the spur for people like John Raystrick and Michael in Scotland to invent patent threshing machines, which gradually superseded the use of the hand flail. After the threshing, the chaff needs to be separated from the cereal grain, which is what we want to make flour of, and you use a basket called a winnowing basket. So you just toss it all up, and the heavy grain falls back into the basket, and the light chaff, particularly if it's a windy day, blows out of the way. So this is how you collect the grain that you want to keep and get rid of all the loose chaff, and it's called a winnowing basket. This is a quernstone, and this is used to grind the clean threshed grain into flour. It's a scale model, so it doesn't work very effectively, and you can see coming out of the side a lot of it is very lumpy, so it will need to be sieved. But this is archetypal woman's work. Phrases like the daily grind spring to mind. But it was also a privilege in medieval times to be able to have a stone like this. The free men or burgesses of Morpeth or Newcastle were actually allowed to have a stone like this in their kitchens rather than use the Lord of the Manor's mill. But the burgesses of Newcastle took this slightly too far and actually established windmills outside the city as their allowed quernstones. These actually stayed in use into relatively recent times because, as you can see, this very coarse meal was ideal for feeding to baby chicks, so they stayed in use to make chick food. And in the Second World War, they were actually used again in remote rural areas to still grind flour. And the last record I've heard of is in the 1970s in Ireland. They were still being used to grind hen food. So you can see it's gone down through there, so you feed it in through the top and it comes out of the sides. Stones like we've seen on the quernstone, but huge millstones, are the basic grinding mechanism of windmills and water mills. It's not until late in the 19th century that there's a new technology to grind flour. This is the steel roller mill, and it works on a similar principle to this little mill here, where you've got almost like a mincer grinding the wheat into flour, but run mechanically. What comes out of the quern is still pretty lumpy because this is actually a miniature scaled down one. So to get the flour out, we need to sieve it, and that gives you a very coarse wholemeal. But if you want a fine wholemeal, you have to sieve it again, and that gives you a flour like you buy in the shop, a stone ground wholemeal flour. And everything that doesn't go through the sieve has to go back through the stones until it all comes out like that. And even the roller mill doesn't produce a totally fine flour, so that also needs to go through the sieve to get the fine flour out. So we've got the flour, and this is what we're going to make bread out of, and this rather large wooden trough is a dough trough. This is the mixing bowl for making the dough in, because you're only going to bake for the household once a week. And if you think you've not just got a family but a farmhouse has all the farm servants, you're making an awful lot of bread dough. So it's a big task, the weekly bread making. For the bread we need flour, but to make the bread rise, to make a leaven bread, we need yeast, and the yeast comes from the beer. So every family would also be making their own beer, and that gives you the yeast for the baking day. And this implement is called a peel, and this is what you need to take your baked bread out of the oven with. So you just slide it in, it's a bit like a pizza one, and then you get your bread out. So that's a peel for getting the bread out of the oven. Now the next stage of our staple diet, the butter to go on the bread, starts with the milk from the cow. So the cows are milked, and the pails of milk are carried into the dairy using the dairy maid's yoke, which I'm wearing here. It's a very ergonomically designed piece of equipment which is actually surprisingly comfortable to wear. When the milk comes into the dairy to make butter, it's put in these setting pans. So overnight the cream rises to the surface. The cream is then skimmed off into the churn. So the churn has, this is a plunge churn with a plunger. So the cream goes into there, plunger goes in, and then you go up and down until you feel the solid butter forming. Now this sort of plunge churn was the standard churn up until the 18th century. But again, they come in different sizes. This is a small one, but even the bigger ones aren't big enough to feed the demand from the growing cities. So again, John Raystrick patents a new form of butter churn. There are several types. The big ones, they're like barrels and you turn them end over end, and the other type has a paddle in, like this little one here. This is only a little tabletop one, but you can see the action of the paddle. Rather than the up and down of the plunge churn, these other ones work with this paddle going round and round, so very much less effort to turn a handle than to go two hands up and down with the large churn. Once the butter comes out of the churn, it's in very small lumps, so it needs to be washed and then it needs to be patted together into a big pat of butter. So these are the butter hands for actually working the butter into the square shape that we associate with butter. These rather funny things, these are for making butter curls. So if you've got the top of the butter, you roll it along and this will make butter curls. You can make pretty patterns on the top of your butter, so that's a butter roller. That will give you a nice ridged effect. If you're selling your butter at market and people are illiterate, if you have a pattern stamp and you stamp your butter, then people will know which butter they bought, they liked, and buy that with the same stamp the next time and then in the market. And more butter rollers, these are other ways of putting patterns on to identify which farm has made which pats of butter. We can now enjoy the fruits of our labours. We've got bread and butter for tea, and this is part of the farmer's Godspeed the plough. Let the wealthy and great roll in splendour and state. I envy them not, I declare it. I eat my own lamb, my own chickens and ham. I shear my own fleece and I wear it. I have lawns, I have bowers. I have fruits, I have flowers. The lark is my morning alarmer. So jolly boys now, here's Godspeed the plough. Long life and success to the farmer.